Hello and welcome to the War Report. Now, we are a little late this week, but it worked out. It was a blessing in disguise because all hell has broken loose, at least in Italy, and a lot more news has come up since the original record date, which we were going to do on Tuesday. But without further ado, let's get right into the news, and let's start out with some Asian news, specifically China and the trade war between us and China. So, if you'd like to lead us off, go ahead.
All right. So last week, Trump placed 10% tariffs on $300 billion worth of Chinese goods, which pretty much ended whatever easing of tensions was going on between the US and China. And so, in response, what China did was they allowed their currency to dramatically fall in value in what is typically called currency manipulation. In fact, Trump ended up having China be labeled as currency manipulators by the federal government, which pretty much hasn't happened since like the 1990s. So essentially, China was just retaliating to Trump's tariffs. And in addition to lowering their value of their currency, China started started purchasing higher amounts of Iranian oil. And the issue with that, with importing higher amounts of Iranian oil, is that it could potentially crash the oil market. Right now, oil is selling at about $60 a barrel, but if China decides to up how much it's importing, it'll go down to $30 a barrel. Now that's good for us in a way for the consumer.
WTF, I love China
Um,
now.
um, but but in terms of OPEC and the U.S. Saudi-Israeli hold, this is a very daunting challenge.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I imagine the folks down in DC, of course, on Wall Street, anywhere, any major financial hub, they're probably shaking in their boots right now. Now, I've said previously about the U.S.-China trade war, it's been more of a ruse, just like tit for tat, take small little jabs at each other, but nothing really. But this is an actual escalation, and I can honestly say I was not expecting this. However, just going back, Trump's policies wherever, just so schizophrenic, I should have seen this coming.
Right, and then there's also China planning to. I don't know if it's already happened or not, but the embargo on all American agricultural products.
Yeah, they did do that. Yeah, good.
Right.
Thank you for adding that.
Yeah, and this is major because there's plenty of Midwestern states like Indiana, for instance, that their greatest trade partner is actually China. And of course, this is, China doesn't have as many cards as America does in a trade war. However, this one, I think what the Chinese are hoping will happen. And I think there's actually, I don't think it should be scoffed at. I think there's a strong possibility that with this embargo, this refusal to buy American agricultural products, they're slowly going to put farmers in a very difficult situation. I know that the base for filing bankruptcy now has changed, so farmers can declare bankruptcy with a smaller amount of loss. Um, this is going to have a ripple effect not only for Trump's reelection, but also for the state of the economy of the state itself. Because at first it'll be the farming sector, but a few months, 6 months down the road, it will begin to affect other businesses as well.
Oh yeah.
So
I
that
mean, speaking as somebody from that area that you're talking about, but the entire economy around here revolves around agriculture. We do what the farmers do. We follow in their footsteps no matter what they do. Now I'm speaking from somebody as Ohio. I imagine Indiana. A lot of these states are the same, but China probably is pulling this. I mean, I figured they would have pulled it sooner, but they probably are pulling it to screw Trump over come the election because, look, I doubt the farmers are going to flip Democrat. It just doesn't happen. But it may demoralize them, keep them away from the polls. And, there's your election interference if you really want to go down that road. A lot of people talk about, oh, Russian interference. But, yeah, like, again, I reiterate this time and time again. I have no problem with putting the screws to China, but the way we're going about it is just insane, and it the unintended consequence, and it again it goes back to the fact that there is no coherence within this administration, and I grow more and more frustrated every week. What I once thought was a strength, the uncertainty of it. Short term, yes. Long term, we're really feeling the heat, and I'm just frustrated with
Yeah,
this.
right. And China is upping the ante. I'm old enough to remember back in the '80s when Reagan was president, and there was this push for patriotic purchasing, so to speak. Because the devil then was Japan, and so there would be a ton of commercials associated with Dodge especially, but there was Ford and others and Chrysler, and it was almost like a guilting. Like you have to buy American if you care about this country, and make your next vehicle American. Well, China has actually already adopted that, and Apple phone sales and Apple products in general are suffering right now in China. Huawei is skyrocketing.
Oh
So
yeah,
the Chinese have quickly latched onto this. So you're seeing an effect, and of course, I mean, I wouldn't want to see it, but let's suppose in the next 5 years, let's say Trump is reelected, you could see China begin to have embargoes or create tariffs on rare earths, right? Because that's what's necessary for manufacturing, most of tech, and China has 80% of it
hmm
worldwide.
yeah,
So,
absolutely. And part
so that's another. It's got like at least three cards, but definitely three cards it can play, and I think it's using those cards right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And in addition, like going back to the halting of the agricultural goods expanding to other sectors of the U.S. economy, one could see that as China trying to lessen the amount of U.S. ships going through trade routes. It's not just so much that they're bringing in goods, but those are actually U.S. ships that are being guarded by naval ships. And
Great point.
so and especially with importing the Iranian oil, that means you're going to see decreased U.S. activity in the East China Sea, whereas you're going to see an increase of activity around the Indian Gulf and the Persian Gulf by Chinese. And so going back to that conversation with Fashi Zizek regarding Atlanticism and the U.S.'s need to protect trade routes. It's not just so much that this trade war is about just the goods and the economy themselves. It is a power struggle over the trade routes.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, what was I was you know what, it'll come back to me. There was something else I wanted to mention
Mhm.
that China has put into effect. But yeah, go on.
That's all I have for the trade war. Do you guys have any other points you want to add to that?
All I can say
If we're going
is,
to deal
uh,
with
go ahead.
Hong, go ahead.
But all I can say is,
If we're going to deal with
okay,
who's going to out Canadian who,
go ahead.
America wins now. Canada has nothing. Um, yeah, I would. I don't know if we're going to delve into what's going on in Hong Kong, but it is
Yeah,
deeply
yeah, yeah. That's our next topic.
okay. Yeah, that's all I have for just China as a subject.
All right.
Want to say in closing about the Chinese subject is me in summer 2018, like May 2018, just bright eye, all optimistic about this trade where we're gonna win, we're gonna crush the Chinese economy. I wish I could just go back in time and slap myself across the face and say you have no idea what you're in for.
Yeah,
All right. So, with the Hong Kong protests, Beijing has issued its sharpest warning so far, basically calling all the protesters arrogant lunatics who should not underestimate the central government's immense force. And so right now, what we're seeing is a buildup of Chinese forces. Right now, it's estimated that there's been about 6 to 10,000 People's Liberation Army troops stationed in Hong Kong. And right now, they're not seen at the protests, but they're around so they can be quickly mobilized. Of the protesters, only 148 have been arrested so far. Excuse me, 420 have been arrested so far total, but overall, it's not the as big as the color revolution as the media has been trying to make it out to be. There's been a little bit of a media battle between the Chinese state media and Rupli and and Reuters and some of these other news orgs who are reporting on the protests. China was actually pointing out all these shootings that were happening in the U.S. as a sign of more destabilization than the Hong Kong protests. So it
Oh
was
boy.
interesting to see that Twitter battle play out between the Chinese state media. But no, it's not as big as I think the West has been trying to make it out to be.
Yeah, it's been prolonged, and Beijing issued a statement that was quickly repeated by Hong Kong and Macau authorities, and the wording was very interesting, saying two particular things stand out. One was, "If you play with fire, you'll perish by it." It's a pretty strong statement. Number two, it said, "Your foreign-born parents will not protect you." Now, for a culture that historically, for over 3 millennia, um, has this enormous regard, almost like near worship of ancestors, to call these protesters the children of foreign-born agents is a uniquely packaged way of what we would call, foreign government saboteurs and so on. But it carries a cultural weight that I don't think most Westerners understand. For us, for many Westerners, it'll sound silly, but that's I think of the strong, even the stronger out of the two statements. China hasn't, unequivocally shown some kind of proof, some kind of evidence that there is foreign backing for this. I am noticing on some media, especially Germany's DW, like a kind of like overly, informative but generally negative take on China's One Belt One Road initiative. Um, why isn't it European enough? Why is it, it's, things that like don't make sense because it's China. That's why. So anyhow, I thought I'd mention that. But also, 20% of Hong Kong, like 20% of China's mainland China's trade is with Hong Kong. It's in excess of $300 billion. So if there is foreign influence in these protests, it could be anything from like this is going to sound very conspiratorial. I'm gonna disavow it probably right away. In fact, I'll disavow it now. But I just wanted to throw it out there that the possibility of creating such chaos in Hong Kong that one, it begins to influence the rest of China, and or that Hong Kong, finds its way back into a European power or a Western power. Now that one is, much much less likely because China's already hinted that their tech capital Shenzhen is like it can be the new pearl of Asia. Hong Kong, in a sense, is being told that they're going to become expendable. Like if Hong Kong has to be sacrificed, there is something else to take its place. So I thought that was something that was very resolute. And Xi Jinping also, he mentioned this last year. He said we're going to be in a fight, and it's going to be a long fight. And I think 2019 is and especially the last week is really proving that.
Oh, absolutely. And just to expand on what you said, there when it comes to foreign influence, now I believe that at first Hong Kong does have a distinct identity from China. A century of separation will do that to you. A century of British rule will cultivate some distinct identity, even if it's just completely artificial. But as time and time goes on, I think foreign influence creeps way more in there to the point where it's just so convoluted, all the different factions you have together. Now, this is nowhere near what they had in Ukraine in 2014, 2013, 2014, or Georgia in 2003 and 2008, or any of these other color revolutions near the Russian border, Eastern Europe, or even some of the, some of the revolutions in the Middle East, such as the Arab Spring or the one in Lebanon, I believe in 2005. Those were all very contrived on the surface, so you could tell complete form back and complete fabrication. But like I said, the Hong Kong ones felt more genuine at first. I'm not saying that makes them good or bad.
Mhm.
I've made clear that I could not care less what happens to um, a city state, what amounts to a city state in East Asia. I don't think it's too vital to American interests. Now, I will say this. I will parrot something I believe both of you have said. I expect things to heat up around Taiwan. I think the West, particularly the United States, are going to start. Look, we've sold the military equipment, we've made the arms deals, but I can see us signing some more pacts, more treaties with Taiwan to prevent similar situation, but as we've said before in this program, if Taiwan is the fall, it's going to fall culturally or economically. It's not going to be a conquest. It's not going to be an invasion, as has been hyped up for the past several decades since then the Chinese Civil War, pretty much. But beyond that, the Hong Kong situation, it's not picking up in Western media. It's not sticking. Nobody cares. Beyond some of the like the weird bastard children between the libertarians and the neocons. Those are the only people that care about this, like the really conservative ink types. And even then, they kind of mention it. They really couldn't care less beyond unless they see something completely outrageous. And of course, the very like anti-Chinese people, like not to insult him. I personally like him, but Black Pigeon Speaks has been really hitting on this Hong Kong thing. Granted, he focuses just like almost exclusively on Asia at this point, so it makes sense. But beyond that, I haven't seen really anything. In the Western media, in more European, Eastern European media, Russian media, even Latin American, pretty much any major media circuit you would find in the world, very little is talking about Hong Kong. It's not drumming up the energy that even Ukraine in 2013 did.
Right. And I mean, just as a side note, I agree with you. Just as a side note, it is getting personal in Hong Kong and in mainland China. There's been tweets, for instance, where one woman who's a nurse at one of the hospitals recommended poisoning some of the police. Like really crazy stuff. Others, tweeted about like, why don't the forces go in and crush them? From crush the traitors in Hong Kong. So like, it is like it. Like internally, yeah, it's amping up. But I would agree with you. Generally speaking, it's not getting the kind of coverage that we would have expected.
No, absolutely. And ironically, it's like backfired with some of the Southeast Asian US partners. Like, for instance, the US has been trying to use this as a reason to put more troops and/or missiles, and even nuclear missiles on the Philippine Islands. And Duterte has been pushed closer to China. He's rejected Trump's calls to put a sort of defensive force in the Philippines against China. And so Duterte seems to have fallen in the hands of China from Trump, whatever weird love affair that was going on back in 2016 or whatever. But
Yeah. We'll get into the Australia stuff after the INF stuff because that sort of plays into this too.
sure, sure. All right. Anything
Yeah, I
else
mean,
on the
if tensions increase with Taiwan, my guess is the sign that that's happening, that it started, is rainbow painted F-35s flying really close to Hong Kong. That's how you know.
Mhm. Yeah, just like the jet stream, a chemtrail of rainbows.
Yeah, rainbow chemtrails.
Yeah, I mean,
That's how you know it's
at
on.
this point, I mean, Taiwan legalized gay marriage, so that's where you're licensed to get free missile systems. I think that's how U.S. diplomacy
Yeah.
works in the 21st century. But yeah, you know,
Simple as.
yeah. So,
Get some of your boys in drag. It's so simple.
oh boy, Poland's in for a rough time if that's the case. But with that, that's aside the point. So I'm gonna move on to the INF. If you two have anything else to say about this, now's the time.
No, go for it.
No, I'm good.
Okay, so after 32 years, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF for short, between the United States and Russia is dead. Now, Secretary Mike Pompeo announced on Tuesday, announced that the U.S. final withdrawal from the accord was last week, and he of course blamed the Russians for violations. And he promised a quote new chapter by seeking a new era of arms control beyond the bilateral treaties of the past, which implies he wants to bring the Chinese onto a future arms control agreement. But I'll touch on that later. Now, when it was first signed by President Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev in 1987, the INF barred both countries from possessing, testing, or deploying ground based missiles, meaning ballistic missiles or, of course, cruise missiles, with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. Now, that's roughly 3,400 miles for our American audience for the proper measurements. Now, I believe you had a little bit more you wanted to say on this, a little bit you wanted to expound on it with.
Yeah, so one thing to keep clear here is that America did not actually violate the INF treaty. It just simply chose to pull the plug. And there was no real reason other to do this. Now, they cited some various violations that Russia may have committed, but none of it actually amounted to any violation of a term of the INF. Now, what I think is actually going on here is that we may have actually had some sort of weird push by the military industrial complex to get these weapons that have been banned for the last 32 years unbanned, which will allow these companies to engage in weapons testing and production and ultimately sales. And so I don't think that this was done because of any real issue between the US and Russia. I think it's more of an internal push in the US by the defense companies that are backing Trump, or I mean, or even the Democrats for that matter, because I'm sure a Democrat would have done the same thing,
Oh,
citing the
absolutely.
election as a reason to do it. But ultimately, my point being, though, is I think the reason for this is those missiles from that haven't been tested or deployed in the last 32 years. I think it's more of a capitalist reason geared toward that. But then there is the possible secondary reason, which could be again to just provide this weaponry to Israel and possibly even Saudi Arabia, because again, Israel does have nuclear weapons, even though they're not actually a part of the non-proliferation treaty. And the my with with their access to nuclear weapons, despite its illegality, I'm thinking that another benefit to rescinding the INF is to provide U.S. partners with these weapons, which could obviously fall into the wrong hands.
Oh,
As far as
absolutely.
Russia, yeah, and as far as Russia, um, I mean, they could just as easily provide the same weaponry to Syria or Turkey or Iran now as well.
Now, I'll expound upon that, and I say a tertiary reason, which we have addressed before, is again, it sort of ties into the capitalistic reasons. We may want to deploy these in East Asia and sell them to countries like Japan, like South Korea, like Australia, which we'll get into. But yeah, I definitely agree. I don't think it was like, oh, because the Russians are conducting all these missile tests and they're just violating the treaty. And yeah, I agree. It was probably for a lot more pragmatic reasons. Now, when this was first announced back last October, vehemently against it, I had a visceral reaction to it. Visceral may be a bit of an overstatement, but I think everyone out there gets my point. I was 100% opposed to
Mm.
it. I'm a bit more I'm a bit more ambivalent towards it now. I don't really think it makes any difference, especially the direction the world is going. The treaty was pretty much dead upon arrival, just there for formalities to say, well, look, the U.S. and Russia, they're making progress towards peace in the world, sort of the end of history BS that they try to throw at us. But yeah, I agree with you. It probably is for capitalistic reasons, which the sales to Israel and sales to East Asian countries and Australia would definitely tie into. Now, I just want to touch on this real quick before we move on. U.S. Wanted to move missiles into Australia. So, following, of course, the death of the INF, newly appointed Defense Secretary Mark Esper, who has his own ties to the military-industrial complex, said he wants to see American ground-based intermediate range conventional missiles deployed to Asia within months. Now, again, this bolsters a previous theory that we had that killing the INF was primarily about China and U.S. trade in the Pacific than Russia. Now, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison has said his country will not host U.S. missiles. Defense Minister of Australia Linda Reynolds said there was no formal request by the United States, who was, and by Esper, who was in the country over the weekend. Now, China, after this, warned against placing U.S. missiles in Japan, South Korea, and Australia. It issued a warning to each of those countries. I believe the Philippines too, but based on Duterte's reaction, I doubt the warning was even needed in the Philippines. But I am curious as to why Australia declined this, because Australian policy has been between the U.S. and China. It has been a bit back and forth, a bit wishy-washy with their Liberal Party in power, which is their conservative party, but whatever. I would expect them to take the more hawkish line in China and want to cooperate more with the U.S. For defense. I mean, we've been signing defensive treaties with their conservative government. I know Morrison is new in office, but his predecessor, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, was signing defensive pacts with the U.S., was signing treaties, and I think they were about to make an arms deal, it just never went through. But I'm curious as to whether Australia rejected this on their own, or whether they didn't want to anger the Chinese and incur economic consequences or throw away economic opportunities they would have with the Chinese. Now, I lean towards the fact that Australia probably wants to play it neutral between this growing feud between China and the U.S. and see which way the wind blows before they really pick a side. That would be my assessment of it, at least.
Right. It, I tend to agree with you that this is probably mostly economic reasons, but I think from an American perspective, you can see that America is right now looking for bases and allies for, I think, a future that they envisioned that, for the next 10, 15 years. And Australia is an obvious choice, an obviously important choice for the Americans to create strong ties with, right? To give pressure. But again, the problem is that very deep connections over the last 30, 40 years. Well, I mean, you could argue even since the 70s have been at work and in play with Western companies, and that would include, Australia as well, where it's going to be remarkably difficult to sacrifice, say, those economic ties, and because what could America give in return is the question.
Yeah, I said it's a pretty valid question. Now, I'd like to also posit another theory. It's a bit far fetched, but I figured for the sake of the show, for the sake of entertainment, I might as well throw it out there. So, under the INF, if a nuclear weapon was tested on your country's territory, you are legally entitled to build nuclear weapons. You can do it completely within the confines of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Forgive me, not the INF, but the NPT. Now, Australia was the testing ground for many of the British nuclear tests. And Australia, it's been thrown around for years and years now, but nobody ever took it seriously, would legally, under international law, under these current treaties, would be allowed to construct its own nuclear weapons. Do you think they will in the coming years? I do think they will, especially as things heat up between the U.S. and China. They may want to say, look, we want to be self-sustaining. We want to separate ourselves from both superpowers. Look, we'll do business with both of you. We'll keep ties with both of you. But we're going to stand as an independent Australia. I could see that happening in throughout the 2020s, 2030s.
I think you're definitely onto something. I could foresee that, and especially for the reason of playing both sides. Hello?
But beyond that, I have, unless you have any further comments on any of the subjects we discussed, I want to get into a little bit of Syria news. I'll try to keep it brief before we get into some other Middle East stuff, and then the Italian upcoming elections and some of the stuff with the. Again, well, but just moving on to Syria, unless either of you have any comments on the Australia issue.
No, I'm good.
I'm good.
Okay, so just a little brief update on Syria. Let's get the map up there, and let's get the map key up there as well. So, on August 3rd, the leader of HTS, Abu Muhammad al Julani, announced that his group would not withdraw, quote, a single fighter or a weapon from the demilitarized zone and vowed to recapture all territory taken by Syrian forces. The withdrawal of radicals from the demilitarized zone has been a key demand for the establishment of a ceasefire. Now, the same day, a senior commander of the Al Qaeda affiliate Horas al Din was killed in an IED explosion in uh, Taftanaz in eastern Idlib. Now, some pro militant groups are blaming Damascus for his assassination. Now, on the 4th, another group of Al Qaeda affiliates shelled a town in northern Latakia with rockets, which inflicted civilian casualties. Now, there's also claims that they had foiled a Russian special operation near Kerbat al Nakus in northwestern Hama. Of course, they claim they killed 2 fighters and goes on. And one of the bigger news out of Syria is that Erdogan announced that the U.S. is planning to enter northeastern Syria with cooperation of the U.S. to set up a safe zone. Now, according to Damascus, since the start of the intervention in Syria, Turkey has deployed 10,655 military personnel, 166 battle tanks, 278 armored vehicles, 18 rocket launchers, 173 mortars, 73 armored vehicles with heavy machine guns, 41 anti-tank missile launchers, and around 280 military police. So that's the
Wow.
biggest news around Syria, and Turkey
Which
is.
is pretty surprising. That's pretty shocking though, considering like Erdogan and the U.S. were on like rocky footing for the last few weeks, and then out of nowhere, well, first Erdogan stated that he was going to still expand the safe zone between Idlib and the Syrian regime. Now, the purpose of Turkey establishing just that whole northern line, they claim, is as a buffer zone from the Kurds. But now, with the establishing of the safe zone, it's a little piece beyond that, more intrusion into Syria. So it's weird how Erdogan is literally playing all sides, and the U.S. Agreed to help them out in this endeavor. And I think it was probably some sort of backroom deal between Turkey and the U.S. to still maintain good relations. Because this is a situation in which Erdogan only benefits. I don't even see how the U.S. is benefiting from this,
Yeah,
other than
well,
it, other than instilling more war in Idlib, which this helps. But my point being is the U.S. doesn't necessarily gain from this move. It seems like they're just trying to win Erdogan back over.
Well, there, I
Right.
will posit this: the fact that there were some murmurs that Trump wanted to get out of Syria again. He wanted to do withdrawal, so this could be some sort of. He tried to make this backroom deal back at the beginning of the year. It's like, oh, we're going to get out of Syria. Turkey's going to take our place. X, Y, and Z countries going to take our place. So I'm wondering if he's trying to pull that kind of deal again. Now, based on the fact he hasn't publicly announced it over the past couple days, I would doubt it. But yeah, it is. It is quite stunning that Erdogan manages to play all sides and come out on top every time. I don't know how he does
Putin's like, what the fuck? This guy's taking all my moves.
it.
Yeah, I mean Erdogan is a wild man. He's really intelligent. He really does know. I mean, you said it best a long time ago. He plays every side but the Kurds. That's exactly what he does.
Yeah, he threatened and blustered, and in the end, he got the deal that he really wanted, not what he promised he would do. So he over asked and got actually what he exactly wanted.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
they've also made statements, the Turkish government, that they want to create a corridor for refugees to return home. Notice that last week, Erdogan made a threat. Well, at least his government did, that we've got 3 million refugees, and we will be willing to send them into Europe if our demands are not met.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
It's like a
um,
biological threat.
yeah. Wow, this is biological warfare on a whole other level.
All right. Should we move on to Iran?
Yeah, let's just knock the Middle East out of the way while you can still join us for the next 15 minutes or so here. So go ahead and take the lead on that if you'd like.
All right, so let's just go back to the Strait of Hormuz real quickly. So right now, the U.S. has been unable still to convince any European nations to aid the U.S. and U.K. in their patrol of the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, the German officials have publicly declined, citing it as no real security concern. And in one thing to keep in mind with the Strait of Hormuz, you got to remember that Trump has now sent, and we'll get into Rand Paul, but Trump has now sent three delegates to Iran. Shinzo Abe, now he's had Emmanuel Macron, and now he's had and Rand Paul, and all three of them have come back with the same response that there's no real reason to police that area unless you're going to go to war. So basically, what's going on is other countries, Europe, Japan, they're recognizing is that the U.S. and the U.K. want them to patrol not to ensure the safety of any trade route, but rather to bolster the security. Because one thing that I think that is holding the U.S. back from war with Iran is that Iran basically has a straight shot into Saudi Arabia. They have a straight shot into UAE, and from the back end, they have Yemenis, Houthi mobilized forces and PLO forces that can invade the mainland of Saudi. So basically, I think um, the U.S. has made its calculation that there is real no buffer between Iran and Israel right now, in the sense that Iran could just march through the Strait of Hormuz through Saudi, and even go up from the back end through Yemen. And so this is the reason why the U.S. is asking for more patrol in the Strait of Hormuz. It's not because of trade routes. It's to uh, ensure a war, basically, to be there for war. And that's why no one is helping the U.S. out right now. And then Rouhani issued an interesting statement. He said that war with Iran will be the mother of all wars. However, peace with Iran will be the mother of all peace. So he's still issuing his stern statements.
Now, there's a little bit about insects you wanted to get into, so I'll let you just carry this segment.
Sure, sure. All right. So, any thoughts on the Strait of Hormuz, GSP?
Well, what I was going to say was it looks like America was basically positioning for a potential blockade, or at least a threat of a blockade, to get what it wants. And like as a preemption for war, right? Or the threat of war. And I mean, I find it shocking that there's no one except Britain willing to do the job. So there's no consensus for it in Europe. Um, no one else is raising their hand. Not even Canada.
No, no, and that's a
We
major
didn't. We're
problem.
not sending one of our laundry ships. Okay, Trump is out of control. No laundry ship for you.
All right.
Stephen
So
Harper would have sent the
going.
laundry ship.
All right. So let's just get to Europe real quick. Europe and Iran. So France is still determined to put Instex into operation, and they have been negotiating with Iranian officials despite America's disagreement. Macron has actually cited Trump's policies as extremely harmful in the cooperation between Europe and Iran. And Macron actually attempted to trigger initiatives to preserve the JCPOA without the U.S. And so on July 30th, Macron and Rouhani spoke for about 100 minutes over the phone. So there's a long conversation about how to basically do the JCPOA without Trump. Um, in addition, it turns out that Macron invited Hassan Rouhani to attend the G7 summit on August 24th. Um, and he encouraged him to meet Donald Trump at the meeting. Now, it turns out that Rouhani has declined the invitation to attend the G7 summit. But interestingly, before we got onto the show, about an hour before, Trump had issued a tweet basically saying, attacking Macron, that he cannot just speak for the U.S. and invite whoever he wants to the G7, essentially. And so right now, what you have is you see that the European partners, we've been covering this disagreement between Europe and Trump over Iran for a few weeks now. And right now, this was the most aggressive move by Europe um, in terms of trying to get Trump out of the picture. Because again, they're not helping Trump out with the Strait of Hormuz because they don't see a security threat. In fact, they see an economic opportunity. And Trump has been in the way of that. And so this is again, Macron and Trump have never been on the same page. Macron wants the EU to have its own military, and Macron wants to be the head of that. So he is trying to, jockey with Trump. He's wagging his balls here, but at the same time, Trump, he is in no real reason to, deal with Macron. And so, especially considering with Brexit and the EU and the US have just never been further, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, hail Putin.
All right, so just one last bit up to wrap this up. So Rand Paul met with the foreign minister of Iran, and I guess during the discussion, Paul told Zarif that Trump would be willing to lift sanctions if Zarif went to the White House to meet with Trump. Once again, this is like the eighth, maybe 10th time an Iranian official has declined a meeting with Trump. Again, Javad Zarif did decline. In response, he was sanctioned. So basically, and Rand Paul did tell Zarif that if he didn't go to the White House, he would be sanctioned. So, I mean, here's Rand Paul violating the NAP, basically trying to force Zarif to the White House, or you get sanctioned. But that didn't work either. And so now Zarif is sanctioned. He's totally not allowed to come to the U.S. to negotiate. So this is where we are.
This is payback for those comments about Rand's hair that Trump made back in 2016 during the debates.
Yeah, it's that Aqua Water Buddha. What was that Aqua Buddha reappearing?
I think that in a way, this is really revealing the like a massive shift that's happening. To request so often and for Iran to decline so often. Um, and Iran knows it somehow knows it's got the cards on its side, and that's interesting. And I would wager that the longer they wait, the better the deck gets.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh
And
yeah.
uh, yeah. The U.S. does not look like it's negotiating from a position of strength at all. It looks pretty pathetic. I'll tell you actually what it reminds me of. Just take a little bit of a tangent here. Sort of those leaked tapes of Harvey Weinstein trying to get laid. Like, oh please, come on, just once. Oh, oh, you better do it, or there's gonna be
Yeah.
consequences.
Pathetic.
Um,
No,
all right. Any
since
other? You guys
since
want to add anything else?
no, but beyond that, since we only have you for like 10 minutes more, I suppose I'll let you cover the little immigration subject you had there.
All right. Yeah, yeah. So, in the wake of the El Paso shooting, a lot of media members have been challenging Trump's rhetoric on Mexican migration. And in particular, they've been attacking the use of the word invasion. So basically, I just wanted to ask you guys whether you think Mexican migration is an invasion. Now, this is a pretty obvious question. I mean, but the thing is that um, when you look at the actual definition of invasion, most people would think of it in terms of military terms. That, oh, this isn't an invasion because they're like economic migrants, they're workers or what have you. They're not actual soldiers or what have you, right? That's how we usually frame invasion. And so most people, when they hear that Mexican migration is an invasion, they don't think of it in those terms. But the problem is that when you actually look at the definition of the term, it's not just militarily related. Oxford plainly just states that it can be an incursion by a large number of people or things into a place or sphere of activity, just broadly, or an unwelcome intrusion into another's domain. And so the term invasion, though linguistically it has these more general, broader connotations that any mass of people in your sort of realm can constitute an invasion, yet we use that term or frame it purely in a military sense. So, what do you guys think about this? The use of the term invasion when it comes to Mexican migrants?
I think it's absolutely accurate, and I'll tell you what kills me about this. A lot of these people who criticize Trump for using the term invasion will then turn around and say Israel is invading the West Bank, which I say, yeah, by that definition they are, but fundamentally it's no different. It's groups of people settling in a foreign land and establishing their own settlements, their own culture, uh, using their way of life into a foreign land, impeding territories not theirs. So I've been actually been saying since 2017. There's no difference between illegal immigration in the United States and Israeli settlements in the West Bank.
Right, and what I would add is I would add two things. One is that perhaps the 20th century is too much with us, but Rome faced several invasions that were both military, but however, there were vastly more just groups of people with some military support, and often that could get crushed. But all you have to do is think of the Goths in the fourth century in the Balkans coming in from where they used to be, which was basically southern Ukraine and Moldova and Romania. So one element isn't there. And however, and I think in the 21st century, we're not going to define empire the way we did 100 years ago because those kinds of empires don't exist. The rules of the game have changed. But if we're going to talk about hegemony and control, it's unquestionable that America is an empire. And so this is also an invasion. Both are true in a 21st century sense. And that's going to be more true because we've completely left that other world behind.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd co-sign that statement, but yeah, like it's more things change, the more they stay the same. We're doing almost exact the same thing, except we're calling our empire an alliance or our hegemony or our world order. It's an empire, having troops halfway across the world in a foreign country, controlling it for your interest, leaning on their governments, leaning on the local governments to get what you want of it. Yeah, you can call it an alliance. Yeah, you can call it the American security umbrella, but it's an empire. It's no different than the British control over name one of the several colonies. But to close out the show, I wanted to get actually a little bit into some Italian news. So, for just under a year and a half, Italy has been ruled by a coalition between the Five Star Movement, which includes Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte, and Lega, which includes, of course, Matteo Salvini, the Interior Minister, and the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, despite stunning successes during their time governing, especially for right wing governments in the West, they've had many internal feuds. It appears that the coalition is unraveling. Now, Salvini said in a statement that he had told Conte that Lega's alliance with the Five Star Movement has collapsed, and that, quote, we should quickly give the choice back to the voters, end quote. Now, he also said that Parliament should be convened in the next week to carry out the necessary procedural steps in order to dissolve the government. Now, Conte responded to Salvini by saying he didn't have the authority to call new elections. But what we have to consider is if Lega pulls out of the coalition, Conte will have almost no choice but to, unless he's going to make a coalition with one of the left wing parties, which is not going to happen. They hate Five Star as much as they hate Lega. Just the association, similar, not compared to the Anglosphere, similar to how they hate the center, right? They hate the Ben Shapiro types, even though they try so hard to distance themselves from the all right, the Republicans, the racists, the Donald Trump supporters. It's similar to that, but again, just a very simplified version of that. Now, I do have to say, initially this move seemed foolish to me, but the worst case scenario is still a broad right wing coalition governing the country with Lega as the largest member. Now, I'll go over some of the scenarios on how a hypothetical Italian election would play out if it were called tomorrow. So, this first one right here, I'll pull up the House and Senate maps. You two won't be able to see them, but our audience will be. Now, in scenario one, a center right coalition would get an overwhelming majority in both the Italian House and Senate with 67 and 68% respectively. Now, with the largest opposition being the center left Democrats at 19% in the House and 18% in the Senate. Now, that's if Lega, Brothers of Italy, what's the other one? Forza Italia. That's if they all band together in one coalition. That's a two-thirds. That's what we call an absolute majority in the United States. Now, well, we also have to consider if those election results play out the same way, but Salvini declines a coalition. This is what it would look like.
Could I ask what was the reason for the row, the separation in the first place between Lega and Five Star?
Just growing tensions in
Like what
general.
were okay?
One of those I don't think there was really a straw that broke the camel's back. I think it was just something that was just brewing under the surface for a while. Considering, in fact, neither of them wanted a coalition in the first place. They just kind of agreed to it, just to keep the country out of the hands of the left. That was early Italian election 2018. Now, scenario two: if Salvini opts for a solo race, Lega wouldn't have the numbers to govern alone. Now, with almost 37% of votes, Lega would be by far the largest party with 283 seats in the House and 143 in the Senate. In both cases, however, as I said, these would not be enough to form a government. But we also have to consider that Berlusconi's Forza Italia would have 62 deputies, and there would be 32 deputies of Meloni's FDI, which is the Brothers of Italy party, and that could be decisive, which leads us into scenario number three, which I think is probably the most likely if an election is called, the coalition actually does fall apart. We'll pull those up right here, and if Lega decides to only ally with FDI, which is much similar to them ideologically, on the more nationalistic Eurosceptic side, as opposed to what Berlusconi's party might be, the results would be a fairly large majority, but it would not be anywhere near the two-thirds majority. Now, with over 43% of the votes, this hypothetical right-wing coalition would have up to 353 House seats and 181 Senate seats. Now, this would leave the three opposition groups in both houses as the center left with 331 seats in the House, 61 in the Senate. The Five Star Movement, 102 in the House, 50 in the Senate. And Forza Italia, Berlusconi's party, with 30 in the House, 15 in the Senate. So, the worst case scenario is a broad right wing coalition that gives them the two-thirds majority. Granted, that also includes establishment center right people like Berlusconi. Now, I said when the Austrian government fell apart, probably 3 months ago at this point, 3 months ago at this point, that they would try something similar in Italy, that they would try to break the coalition. But I can see Salvini is he's feeling bold, he's feeling brave in this because Lega, ever since they've gotten the power, their poll numbers have gone up. They eclipsed the Five Star Movement back in 2018, and they became a much more popular party. And again, they were still sitting as the junior party in the coalition. Now, I think if an election is called, which is fairly likely, I'm not going to say it's a guarantee, Lega, they will be in a comfortable position. Now, my biggest fear is that they try to go with the broad coalition, try to bring in like the center right people, like the establishment right people, like Berlusconi, especially with Berlusconi's reputation in Italy. Not good at all. But it is rather white pilling to see that no matter what, the centrists and the left wingers stand to gain nothing from a hypothetical election.
Mm. Interesting, and you think that he's pushing for this, Salvini, because he feels bold, or because it might have anything to do with splitting off from Five Star? I guess in a way you've already answered that question, because if they've already eclipsed Five Star, maybe he can go for this now.
Oh yeah, it was a begrudging coalition from the beginning. Five Star and Lega both said in March 2018, "We will not form a coalition." Lo and behold, and by June they formed a coalition. So it was an uneasy alliance to say the best at first. Salvini and Conte, whenever they're
Mhm.
together, you could just tell by the chemistry of the two. They weren't necessarily comfortable around each other. Now I don't think Conte's been a bad prime minister at all. I think actually his more internal knowledge, as opposed to the more celebrity status of Salvini, had been a good synthesis. Now I think Maloney, the leader of FDI, again is much more ideologically consistent with Italy, and she's also much more in line with what Salvini would believe. So I think a Maloney Salvini coalition would work. She would, of course, be the junior partner, with the FDI being the junior partner. But yeah, they would have that celebrity status and, of course, like the workhorse. Now, Salvini also would be in the office of prime minister at that point, so it may complicate things a
Mhm.
bit. But I kind of do have to say I feel bad for Luigi Di Maio. He's the other deputy prime minister. Just kind of got pushed to the side. It's just like he's chopped liver. Nobody cares about him.
Many such cases with guys named Luigi.
Oh, of course.
I mean, do I
I'll,
have to bring up a donkey?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Salvini's very charismatic. And ambitious. I mean, he's managed his image extremely well. He's known how to be, I suppose, forceful when he thinks there's an advantage with his supporters to be so. I think he's been judicious and careful with, say, backroom deals and closed meetings when it comes to meeting other EU member leaders. So I can see why he's confident. I think he's had about a year and a half to develop this, and I suppose it's the next logical step. I
Yeah,
mean, the iron is still hot.
I would say so. And just Salvini's charisma, his ability to juggle many opposing factions. We even see this on the world stage. He'll meet with Bibi Netanyahu, go to the wall in Jerusalem, talk about how much he loves Israel and how big of a Zionist he is. But then the next day he's making deals with the Syrian government to return refugees to Europe, and he's with Putin in Moscow. So he knows his way around, and a lot of people were critical, like, oh, why is he at the wall? Why is he selling out to Israel? Again, like, look, it's par for the course. You have to,
Because
yeah,
obviously Anglicans are powerful.
oh yeah, of course. But yeah, point being is, like I said, I think he has the celebrity, but I also think he needs a workhorse behind him. And like I said, Maloney could be that workhorse. Conte has been a decent workhorse, but again, I think there's too much difference now. I think the rift has grown so far, considering the fact it was somewhat of an unwilling coalition at first. That's probably best that they go their
Mm-hmm.
separate ways. And again, if Five Star is one of the main opposition party, it's not like they're all for open borders or neoliberalism or globalism. So if that's your main opposition, I say you're in a pretty good state. Similar to how in Hungary, one of the main opposition parties is pretty much just like, oh, we're just Orban light. Yeah, of course, you have like the really center left party and the really neoliberal party, but at the end of the day, it's pretty wide consensus amongst the political class and the people of that country. Well, we're a pretty solidly right wing, we're a pretty solidly populist country, so I'm not nervous at all for Italy. I'm actually a bit optimistic that Salvini may come to the office of prime minister. Now, I think again, like I said, maybe a bit early for him, or throwing him in it may be the best the best preparation you can have for it. But like I said, he needs to find the right workhorse, and I hope Bologna is it.
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, I wasn't sure this afternoon, if this was too quick or not. As I saw some tweets and I read a few things that some people thought it would, and other people thought it was just right. So, and I'm not absolutely up on, Italian politics, not to your level. So, I mean, this is persuasive. I can see why it's an opportune moment for Salvini.
Oh yeah, yeah, and especially with that Kremlin backing, he's got it guaranteed.
That's right. There
Call
has
up
to
the
be a
Macedonian
photo.
hackers.
That's right. I'm ready.
Oh yeah.
Uh, Let me tell you, I'm going to be really busy in August.
Oh boy, oh boy. I hear those Kremlin rubles. They're really something. I've been trying to get on that racket for a while, but that's pretty much all the news I have for the week. And I figured I'd finish up with probably the story I was personally most invested in. Thought was probably the biggest shift of the week, and especially like Italy was sort of the one that broke into the populist right in Western Europe. At least we see it rising in France. We see it kinda in the UK. Say what you will about Farage, but he's got his upsides, of course. Say what Denmark, they may be like social democrats, leftists, but on immigration policy, at least they got their heads screwed on right. But beyond that, I have no other topics for the week. I have no other news for the week. So unless you have anything you'd like to plug, any other subjects you'd like to discuss, I'm going to bring it to a close.
uh, no, that's about it
I'm
for me.
good. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and goodbye.